In this video, I want to introduce the Black Death, or the plague. The bacterium that causes the disease that we call the plague or the Black Death is a bacterium called Yersinia pestis. It's gram-negative, which means it has two membranes and can make it difficult to treat with antibiotics sometimes. But we have known about the plague, we as in humans, have known about the plague for thousands of years. It's been described throughout history. But the organism that causes plague, Yersinia pestis, was not identified until 1894. So in terms of, human history, we really haven't known about this bacterium for very long. Plague is normally a disease of animals. Sometimes humans accidentally get infected. And how does that happen? Most often, what happens is an infected rodent, rats or other rodents, are bitten by fleas. The fleas then can bite people, and that can transmit the bacterium. So in human history, it didn't really become common for people to get plague until people started living in close proximity to one another, but also in close proximity with animals. And you might think, well, I don't live in close proximity with rats, but that's because you do your best to keep rats out of your home. Unless it's your pet. And what would happen is, people would have rats in their food storage or just in their homes. It was hard to get rid of. And so it was much more common for plague to come around. So again, I mentioned that the normal life cycle of plague is that it will be either in animals in the wild. So these are wild rodents, squirrels, whatever, wild rodents. But sometimes it can enter the urban cycle. This is more rare now. So it's less common that we see this now. But it can happen in an urban cycle where domestic rodents, like the rats and mice that come into your home, could get infected by flea bites. It's really uncommon to see direct contact between a rodent and a human causing plague. It's much more common that the contact between the flea and the human will cause plague, flea and human. In the wild, sometimes direct contact with the rodents can also cause plague, but it's most common that it's the flea. A rare, or maybe not rare, but uncommon complication of plague is that it can get into the lungs. They call it pneumonic plague. And when that happens, it's really easy to spread person to person. Normal plague doesn't usually spread person to person. Only the pneumonic form does. So the three types of plague that we can see, the bubonic plague, and that's the one that gets called the Black Death because you get these inflamed lymph nodes that get really swollen and can turn black. Fever, chills. A septicemic plague is when the bacteria goes into your blood, causes sepsis. That can cause bleeding into skin and other organs. So now the patient's whole tissues will turn black. And the pneumonic plague, which is that one I just mentioned before, when it gets into the lungs, and this can cause rapid shock and death. So here you see the infected and swollen lymph nodes, the toes that have gone necrotic. So symptoms of bubonic plague can include bloody nose, swelling in the groin or armpit or wherever you have lymph nodes, pneumonia. The buboes, these inflamed and swollen lymph nodes, will spread, and you can have purple spots because of hemorrhaging, and they'll eventually turn black, and that's why it's called the Black Death. Throughout history, plague has been relatively well known. These are just a handful of selected pandemics, a worldwide infection or an epidemic, so kind of a local infection, that are known or thought to be caused by Yersinia pestis. The one that people talk about a lot is the Black Death, where there was this period of about 7 years or so where the infection spread throughout Europe. The Black Death, that one in the 1300s, eventually scientists have figured out that it came from east of Europe, so Asia, with black rats that were on trade ships. And it peaked during the 1340s and 50s. And it's really hard to go back in time and you might wonder, well, how do you not know how many people died? Like, people's records were a little bit spotty back then. There was no internet. It was really hard to sometimes keep track of people. So it was easy to lose people in terms of like, I don't know where they went. Did they die? I don't know. Did they move? I don't know. So it's estimated that it killed anywhere from 75 to 200 million people, which is thought to be 30 to 60% of the European population at the time. This was also one of the early recorded instances of biological warfare. Groups would throw plague corpses over like castle walls to infect everybody inside. So that's what the Mongols did. They would catapult plague corpses over castle walls, so everybody kind of got in the castle and was all safe, and then here comes these like infected bodies. So here what they're trying to show you is the spread of the Black Death from 1346 onward, and it's thought that it came on trade ships from Central Asia through the Black Sea. So this was in the 1346, and then the dark red is 1347. And you see that it's kind of at some of these major ports like Constantinople, that's Istanbul now, Sicily, south of France. And then the next year, like Barcelona, Valencia, Tunis, Cairo, and then it just spread and spread and spread through there. And when things like this happened, it wasn't that people at the time knew that it was caused by a bacterium. People didn't know. They didn't know about bacteria. They didn't have microscopes. So, who was causing the disease? What was causing the disease? It was generally people you didn't like, people who were different from you. So at the time, people who were blamed for causing the plague included people like Jews, the Romani, or more colloquially known as the Gypsies, but that's not a term that we typically would use. We would use Romani. Lepers, people with leprosy, and really just any general foreigner. They were responsible. And so people belonging to these different groups were killed or imprisoned because they were thought to be spreading disease. And of course, we know that that's not true. That's not how it really works. But that was the thought at the time. So in order to cure the infection, you get rid of those people, or you can smell herbs. You could live in the sewers. And the thought process behind that was, oh, well, maybe it's the bad air that's causing it. So if we have other bad air by living in the sewers, it'll like cancel out, or we could smell good things that'll cancel out the bad air. They didn't know. It was the best they could do. Of course, you can always pray. If you are religious enough, that can help. That was the thought at the time. Bathing in urine or stuffing buboes with feces, I couldn't begin to explain the logic on that one to you. So until scientists really were able to get in and identify the cause, there were some debates about what organism caused the Black Death. Scientists were pretty sure that it was an infectious disease. It wasn't foreigners. It wasn't not praying hard enough. It was an infectious disease. And so with the advances in molecular technology, looking at DNA, scientists were able to isolate and identify that the bacterium Yersinia pestis was found in people who died of what people called the Black Death. The symptoms of the Black Death matched what we know Yersinia pestis causes, but this was really that final piece of evidence that really supported the idea that the Black Death was caused by Yersinia pestis. One other thing they can do when they analyze the DNA is determine how related the different bacteria are. The Yersinia pestis from East Asia, the Yersinia pestis found in Europe, the Yersinia pestis found in California. And by looking at that relatedness, scientists have started to figure out that there might be other types of Yersinia pestis. If it's the same species of bacteria, but it has maybe some different genes, we call them strains. That's this word right here, a strain. That there might be some strains of Yersinia pestis in rodents that we have not identified in humans yet. So we don't know how humans would react if they got those infections. So what is important to think about are some of the changes that occur in society in response to an infection. And the first time I taught this course was in 2015, which was, pre-COVID. And now, of course, it is, a few years after COVID. And I guess our lives have gone sort of back to normal. But I think we can all point out changes in society in response to COVID. And a lot of those changes that we saw in society in response to COVID have comparisons when we go back and look at changes in response to plague. So, there were these two kind of schools of thought here. The fear of people who were different, right? And I told you on one of the previous slides that they were afraid of Jews or the Romani or lepers or foreigners. And I think we saw that there were also people worldwide who were afraid of different people who might have had COVID. And there was a lot of anti-Asian sentiment because it was thought that, they were the ones responsible for COVID because COVID happened to be found there first. So that fear of people who are different. People who relied on extreme prayer versus eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we may die. And I think if we kind of translate that to modern times, again, people who maybe not prayer in this case, but trusted more in modern medicine, like, okay, let me wear my mask, let me wash my hands, let me get my vaccine, right? They did all those things that were responsible. And that's what prayer was at the time. That was the responsible thing to do. Versus, whatever. And I think we know those people too. Whatever, I'm going to get COVID anyway. Why would I wear a mask? Oh, it's just a cold. Why am I going to get a vaccine, right? So you kind of had those extremes. After the plague, there were labor shortages. Well, because everybody died. So this was in feudal Europe. So there were people called lords who owned a lot of land. They had to improve working conditions to get better workers. And again, I think we see that now. You have to, you can't treat people like garbage just because they work in fast food or they work a minimum wage job. You have to pay them better. You have to treat them better. Same thing. There was a distrust in God and decreased church attendance. And I think people see that a lot with disease, even now. How could God let this happen? So they didn't trust in God anymore. Differences in the societal response, this actually led to the end of feudalism because people weren't going to tolerate poor working conditions. They weren't going to go out and die to work. They weren't going to be paid poorly to work. And the poor revolted over treatment by the wealthy. Okay, and I think, we see that too with a lot of that, anti-1% sentiment even now. So the modern distribution of the plague, it is found in multiple countries. You can see, of course, over here that it is found in the US. The most recent data from the CDC are through 2020. The dot is placed in the state of residence. So you see there's in Connecticut, in Maryland, in Georgia, in Michigan, those states don't have the plague. What happened was probably those people were traveling over here in the western part of the US and then got diagnosed when they got home. And then this case right here in Illinois, this is in Chicago, it was associated with a lab infection. So the lab was working on plague and a person got infected. So in modern times, what do we do for treatment? Well, hospitalization and isolation. We would do laboratory tests to confirm that a person had the plague so we could try to grow the bacterium out of the blood. You could do microscopic examination of the lymph glands, blood, sputum, right? The mucus that people cough up. And generally, you want to start antibiotic treatment right away because it can progress pretty quickly and get dangerous. There are some antibiotics of choice that work pretty well. And people who've been in close contact with a plague patient, especially if the person has the pneumonia symptoms, that coughing and sneezing, coughing up sputum, those people who've been in close contact should also be identified and evaluated because remember that mnemonic form, that part where people are coughing and have those pneumonia symptoms, that part is very contagious from person to person. The U.S. Public Health Service requires that all cases of suspected plague be reported immediately and that diagnosis be confirmed by the CDC. It's a very important infection. It can be very, very dangerous. So the CDC and the other health organizations, both local, state, want to know what's going on. So recent plague, we haven't had huge outbreaks of plague. The last real plague epidemic was in the 1920s in Los Angeles. So this is the data going back from 2000 to 2020. Again, that's the most recent data I could pull from the CDC. They had other things going on, I think, than worrying about plague in 2020. And, a high of 17 cases in a year, but mostly hovering below 10. Only 2 years in the past 20, right, from 2000 to 2020, had more than 10 cases. And for the most part, even though there have been plague cases every year, there are not deaths every year. The highest was 4 deaths in 2015. And if you average these numbers out, it averages seven plague cases per year. That's about the average. So here are some headlines about plague. A plague killed a cat in southwest Idaho, made a child sick. What is the plague? Why is it here? Second case of plague, another Yosemite visitor investigated in California. So we do have plague in California. It is, I don't want to say relatively common, but it's not shocking when somebody in the Sierra who's been at a place like Yosemite turns up with plague. It's like, oh, okay. I'm not shocked. Camping is canceled at Phish's Colorado concerts. Blame the plague-infected prairie dogs. Plague is back. It never went away, but we have to have a dramatic headline. Plague is back, how to protect yourself when traveling out west. So what are risk factors for plague? Again, it's not so common that, oh my gosh, you might get plague. It's kind of like winning the lotto. Yeah, somebody's going to get plague. Somebody's going to win the lotto. It's probably not going to be you. Sorry. If you've actually won the lotto, though, let me know. I think that's very cool. Rural and non-urban residency, especially in geographic areas with known plague foci. Do you live in the foothills with a lot of ground squirrels? Maybe you're at higher risk. Contact with sick animals, small rodents, or other possible hosts. Wilderness activities, camping, hiking, sleeping on the ground, hunting. If you've been bitten by fleas, if there is recent plague in the community, if you work as a veterinarian, and summer months are where we have the highest incidence of plague.